On the morning of July 6, 2026, in a farming village called Dengwei in southern China's Guangxi region, the water arrived faster than anyone could plan for. Days of record rainfall from Typhoon Maysak had already pushed the Lulin Reservoir past its limits, and when the embankment finally gave way, it didn't trickle into the valley below. It poured. Within hours, the flood had swallowed roads, fields, and homes across Hangzhou, a city of nearly 1 million people. By the time regional officials stood in front of cameras 3 days later, the toll was already severe. 39 people died across Guangxi, 26 of them from that single reservoir breach. 9 more are still missing. 130,000 residents evacuated, pulled out by a fleet of over 5,000 boats and thousands of emergency personnel wading through currents that were, by some accounts, strong enough to sweep grown men off their feet. Rescue teams were still pulling more than 10,000 trapped students and teachers out of flooded school buildings days after the initial breach, wading through currents strong enough to sweep a grown adult off their feet. That is the disaster. That part is not in question, and it deserves to be said plainly before anything else, because what happened next in Dengwei village became, almost by accident, one of the strangest news stories of the year, and it very nearly buried the human cost underneath it, because somewhere in that floodwater, on the edge of the village, a set of mesh enclosures holding a very different kind of resident gave way. And what came out of them is the reason you're watching this video, but almost nobody covering the snakes in that water stopped to ask the one question that actually mattered, not how many got out, not what species. The real question was why a flooded farming village in southern China had 800 to 900 snakes living in it in the first place. That answer turned out to be far stranger and far more revealing than the flood itself. I'm Dr. Graham Whitmore, and this is the story underneath the story that went viral. Not the panic, but the industry that made the panic possible and the science that most of the coverage got wrong. Let's start with what actually happened, because the verified sequence is genuinely dramatic on its own, without any embellishment. The facility that flooded sat in Yunbiao Township on the outskirts of Dengwei Village, one of somewhere between 500 and 600 snake farms operating in the Hangzhou area alone. Its enclosures were built with fine mesh specifically engineered to prevent exactly this kind of escape. But the floodwaters that hit the region weren't a normal flood. Some areas recorded over 35 inches of rain in a matter of days. The force of that water didn't just breach the mesh, it collapsed the structure housing it outright. A local village official estimated that somewhere between 800 and 900 snakes had been on site when the facility gave way. Most of them, according to interviews with a nearby wildlife breeding company manager, were Indo-Chinese rat snakes, a common, non-venomous species raised throughout the region. But cobras and Chinese rat snakes were also housed there, and it's the cobras that made the footage travel around the world. Video posted in the days that followed showed snakes moving through submerged streets, some with their hoods raised above the waterline, paddling past half-drowned homes like they'd lived there their whole lives. What the viral clips didn't show was what happened next, and it's a part of the story that deserves far more attention than it got. It wasn't the government that cleared the village, it was the village itself. A civilian team of 7 or 8 residents, organized on their own with fishing nets and whatever equipment they had on hand, began working the flooded streets within a day of the breach. A team member named Mr. Zhu later told state media they worked continuously for 2 straight days, moving from house to house as neighbors called in sightings. Snakes, it turns out, don't scatter randomly after a flood like this. They seek out the nearest dry, concealed space, which in a flooded village usually means the corners of houses, the gaps behind furniture, the spaces under stairs. Zhu's team learned to read that behavior fast. By the end of the second day, they had captured somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 snakes, a number that actually exceeds the original estimate of how many had escaped, suggesting the true total was higher than first reported. Every animal they caught was handed to professionals for release back into the wild, away from the village. "We caught 2,000 or 3,000 in 2 days," Zhu told Beijing News. "We've basically cleared them all out. That should be the end of a fairly remarkable containment story. Mostly, it is. But it isn't entirely a clean ending, and the honest version of this story has to include the part that went wrong. One woman in Yunbiao Township was bitten during the flood, and because the roads into the area had been destroyed by the same water that released the snakes, her transfer to a hospital was delayed. She later died. It's a single death buried inside a viral news story about hundreds of escaped reptiles, and it's worth pausing on because it's the only fatality in this entire event that snakes are actually responsible for, and it happened not because containment failed, but because a disaster of this scale makes even routine emergency care nearly impossible. So that's the event. Verified, sourced, and honestly dramatic enough to stand on its own. But it's not actually why I wanted to make this video, because the snakes in that water were never really loose in the way the headlines implied. They were always exactly where a very specific, very old industry had put them. And once you understand that industry, the flood stops being a horror story and starts being something far more interesting, a rare, involuntary window into a part of China most of the world has never heard of. Guangxi is not famous for snakes to the outside world. It's known, if it's known for anything internationally, as the jasmine capital of China, a region where that fragrant flower has been cultivated for tea for roughly 500 years. But underneath that reputation, for the better part of a century, the region has also been quietly building one of the largest reptile farming industries on the planet. Over 100 snake species have been recorded across Guangxi, and for generations, catching and eating snakes was simply part of local life, considered a nourishing, even medicinal food by many of the region's ethnic minority communities. That local, small-scale tradition might have stayed local forever. What changed it was demand. Starting in the 1990s, as China's middle class expanded rapidly, appetite grew for snake as a luxury food and for snake-derived products in traditional medicine faster than wild populations could ever sustainably supply. So farming took over. By 2020, government-affiliated reporting put the number of snakes being raised across Guangxi at nearly 20 million, spread across more than 14,000 individual breeding operations. To put that in perspective, in the most snake-dense breeding villages in China, captive snakes have been documented outnumbering human residents by close to 3,000 to 1. That number alone is the kind of fact that sounds invented until you check it, and it's real. And Guangxi isn't even the only place in China where this scale of snake farming exists. Other well-documented snake farming villages elsewhere in the country have built similar economies around captive reptiles, some generating millions of dollars a year from an industry that, to most outsiders, sounds like something out of a horror film rather than a legitimate government-recognized agricultural sector. Guangxi's version of that economy just happens to be the largest, and the one that, for 1 week in July, ended up flooding into the wider world's attention by accident. But here's where the story actually shifts, and where I think the last 2 weeks of coverage missed something important. That 14,000 farm industry doesn't really exist anymore, not in that form. After the wildlife consumption ban China implemented following the COVID-19 pandemic, an entire economic model built on farming animals for food was thrown into crisis almost overnight. Guangxi's snake industry had a choice: collapse or transform. According to Yang Peisheng, director of the Specialized Committee of Medicinal Snakes under the Guangxi Wildlife Conservation Association, the region chose transformation. Thousands of small, loosely regulated farms consolidated down to roughly 300 large-scale, standardized breeding enterprises. And the industry's center of gravity shifted almost entirely away from food and toward medicine, research, and pharmaceuticals. Regional officials now describe an industry moving from what one report called a breeding and catering supply chain worth tens of billions of yuan toward a breeding, medical research, and deep processing model built around anti-cancer compounds and medical aesthetic raw materials, with a projected scale that could eventually exceed 500 billion yuan. In October of 2024, Guangxi formally listed 10 snake species, including the Chinese rat snake and several cobra species, as officially approved for regulated captive breeding. What flooded in Dengwei village wasn't some relic of an outdated wildlife trade. It was a small piece of a rapidly modernizing biomedical supply chain, one most people outside China, and frankly, most people inside it, have never heard mentioned. And that supply chain exists for a genuinely serious reason, which brings us to the part of this story that I think matters most and that almost nobody covering the viral videos bothered to mention. Snakebite is a real and significant public health problem in China. Research on Guangxi specifically has documented that this region alone is home to at least 20 distinct venomous snake species, 14 of which are considered highly dangerous. Broader estimates suggest roughly 100,000 people are bitten by venomous snakes across China every year, with a fatality rate in the range of 5 to 10%, and permanent disability affecting a further quarter to nearly a third of survivors who live. Researchers studying venom from the Chinese eastern Russell's viper, a species found in Guangxi, have noted that clinical literature on Chinese snakebite cases is scarce and difficult to access internationally, in part because so much of it is documented only in Chinese language. Medical journals. That's not a footnote. That's the actual reason regulated snake farming exists in this region at industrial scale in the first place. Someone has to supply the venom that pharmaceutical labs process into antivenom, and someone has to do it consistently enough that hospitals across a snakebite-prone region can keep emergency stock on hand. The process itself is slow, precise, and almost nothing like the popular image of venom extraction. Trained handlers milk individual snakes on a rotating schedule. The venom is freeze-dried and cataloged by species and even by region, because venom composition can vary meaningfully between populations of the same snake, and then it's injected in carefully controlled, non-lethal doses into host animals, typically horses, whose immune systems generate the antibodies that eventually become antivenom serum. It's a slow, expensive, unglamorous pipeline, and it depends entirely on farms like the one in Dengwei staying operational. When Hangzhou hospitals reassured the public in the days after the flood that anti-venom supplies remained fully stocked, that reassurance existed because of the very industry the flood had just partially destroyed. Now, here's where I want to correct something, because getting this wrong is exactly the kind of mistake that erodes trust in how we talk about wildlife, and it's worth doing carefully. When most people hear about hundreds of captive-bred snakes escaping into the wild, their minds jump, understandably, to two of the most infamous ecological disasters in modern conservation history. In the Everglades, Burmese pythons that escaped or were released from the exotic pet trade have established a thriving, breeding wild population, and the science on the damage is now unambiguous. Long-term surveys have documented severe declines in native mammal populations across the python's range, in some cases reductions of over 90% for species like raccoons and opossums. On Guam, a single invasive predator, the brown tree snake, arrived by accident after World War II and went on to functionally wipe out the island's native forest bird species, an ecological collapse so complete it's still taught as a textbook case of what one introduced predator can do to an isolated ecosystem. Researchers studying invasive water snakes in the western United States have documented the same underlying pattern again and again. It's snakes specifically as a group that tend to do the most ecological damage when they turn up somewhere new, precisely because they're efficient, generalist predators moving into a landscape where nothing has evolved defenses against them. That's the pattern people were, understandably, primed to expect when they saw hooded cobras swimming through a flooded Chinese village. Hangzhou is not like that, and the distinction matters enormously. The overwhelming majority of what escaped the Dengwei facility were Indochinese rat snakes, a non-venomous species that is already native to the region, not an exotic species being introduced somewhere it has never existed. The cobras and kraits in the mix are a minority, and they, too, are native to southern China, not foreign invaders establishing a new range. And critically, these animals were not left to spread and breed freely the way Burmese pythons were in Florida. They were actively hunted down within days by a coordinated civilian effort and returned to the wild under the guidance of professionals, which is closer to an emergency wildlife release than an invasion. A Burmese python in the Everglades is a predator with no evolutionary history in that ecosystem, facing prey that never developed defenses against it, in a landscape with no natural population control. A rat snake native to Guangxi, temporarily displaced by a flood and then recaptured within 48 hours, is neither of those things. The ecological risk profile isn't just smaller here, it's a fundamentally different category of event. And conflating the two, which a lot of the viral coverage did, whether intentionally or not, tells you something honest about how quickly a story about snakes turns into a story about fear rather than a story about facts. That said, I don't want to leave you with the impression that everything about this event was resolved cleanly, because it didn't, and a story that only tells you the reassuring parts isn't one you should trust. The official death toll from the broader Guangxi flooding, 39 people, was met with visible skepticism on Chinese social media in the days after it was announced, and no independently verified casualty count has been published to confirm or contest that figure. That's not me suggesting a cover-up. It's me being honest that in a disaster of this scale, with this much infrastructure destroyed, precise numbers take time, and sometimes they never fully firm up. It's also worth saying plainly that while the civilian snake-catching effort was remarkably effective, it was civilian. Volunteers with fishing nets did work that, in almost any other country, would have involved trained wildlife control officers. That it worked as well as it did is a genuine credit to the people of Dengwei village. It's also a sign of how thin the formal safety net around this industry actually is when a disaster this size hits it directly. For an industry now valued, or at least projected, in the hundreds of billions of yuan, the actual containment response when one of its facilities failed was 7 or 8 neighbors with fishing nets and 2 days of unpaid, exhausting labor. That gap between the industry's scale on paper and its emergency infrastructure on the ground is worth sitting with. It's the kind of detail that gets lost the moment a story becomes a viral clip instead of a documented event. And the snakes weren't the only captive animals that flood put back into the wild that week. At Guangxi, not far from Hangzhou, floodwaters rose more than 3 meters, submerging nearly the entire facility. Staff described risking their own safety to lock down the enclosures of the zoo's predators before the water hit. More than 100 animals went missing in the chaos that followed, including zebras, porcupines, ostriches, emus, and raccoons. Days later, villagers in a nearby community found a zebra wandering calmly through their streets. Zoo officials identified her as a pregnant female who had been swept out of her enclosure and carried by the current, alive, disoriented, but alive. Not every animal was so fortunate. Several of the zoo's carnivores drowned before staff could reach them, trapped in enclosures built to keep them safely contained rather than to survive a flood. The zoo's owner later told local media that staff had gone back into rising water more than once to try to secure the most dangerous animals first, a decision that says something quiet and real about what people are willing to risk for creatures that, on an ordinary day, they're simply paid to look after. It's a smaller story than the one about the snakes, and it got a fraction of the coverage, but it's the same story wearing a different face. An entire regional economy built around keeping animals in carefully controlled captivity, tested all at once by a flood that didn't recognize the difference between a snake farm's mesh and a zoo's steel bars. So step back and look at the whole shape of this. A reservoir breaks in southern China, and the flood that follows kills 39 people and displaces 130,000 more. In the chaos, a snake farm gives way, and several hundred reptiles end up in the streets of a flooded village, filmed by residents and shared around the world within hours, because a cobra in floodwater is simply more visually arresting than a statistic about displaced families. Underneath that footage sits an industry most viewers never knew existed, a 14,000 farm network that consolidated and transformed itself into a modern biomedical supply chain after a pandemic nearly destroyed it, now producing not just food and folk medicine, but the antivenom that keeps roughly 100,000 snakebite victims a year alive, and pursuing cancer research most people would never think to connect to a flooded village in Guangxi. And underneath that, a piece of ecological nuance that almost nobody bothered to check. That what looked, for one viral weekend, like the opening scene of an invasive species catastrophe was actually something closer to a community-led emergency response, executed largely by volunteers with fishing nets, that had the situation contained within 48 hours. None of that erases the tragedy sitting at the center of this story. 39 people are dead. A woman lost her life to a snake bite made fatal only because a flood had cut off her path to a hospital. Those facts don't get smaller just because the science around the snakes themselves turned out to be less alarming than the footage suggested. What I think this event actually reveals, once you look past the viral moment, is something a little more uncomfortable than a simple animal escape story. We've built entire industries around controlling animals precisely enough that we rarely have to think about what happens when that control fails all at once. Most of the time, the mesh holds. Most of the time, the enclosure does its job, and the systems built to manage venom, meat, medicine, and captivity stay invisible, running quietly in villages most of us will never hear the names of. It's only when a typhoon breaks a reservoir that we're forced to see the machinery underneath and to ask honestly what we actually owe the animals inside it the moment that machinery fails. Not just the snakes, and not just the zebra found wandering a village street pregnant and disoriented, but the entire quiet arrangement we've built between human need and captive life, the one that only ever becomes visible to the rest of the world when it breaks. If this changed the way you think about that viral footage you probably saw a couple of weeks ago, let me know in the comments and tell me whether you think an industry like this deserves more scrutiny or more credit for how it handled a genuine crisis. If it gave you a fuller picture of a story you thought you already understood, share it with someone who only saw the headline version. And subscribe, because there are more stories like this one hiding underneath the viral footage everyone else stopped looking at too soon. I'm Dr. Graham Whitmore, and I will see you in the next video.